NBC 10 at Issue starts now.
Coming up next on NBC 10 at Issue, toxic coworkers. We've got tips for dealing with the people who can make your work life miserable, and we answer the questions you've sent in, like what to do when your coworker spills your private conversations to the boss. Toxic coworkers. You know the type, the people who poison your 9 to 5 with complaints, they take all the credit, or they may have a volatile personality. The good news is there are things you can do about it. Joining me now, as promised, is Julie Ragatz, back once again. She's an assistant professor of ethics from the American College of Financial Services, and she is here to answer your questions. Thanks so much for being back.
I'm glad to be with you.
We had you last week. We got some questions in from viewers. We'll get you to answer those questions in just a moment. But first, how do you describe what a toxic coworker is?
So a toxic coworker, much like a toxic work environment, goes beyond kind of attitudes we don't like. So there's there's a coworker who's difficult, or a coworker who you're like, it's kind of negative. But a toxic coworker is actually engaging in behaviors that undermine the productivity of the work environment. So when we think about toxicity, what we're thinking about is behaviors that are problematic, not just kind of maybe fleeting attitudes or just kind of demeanors.
We did get some questions in from our viewers who were watching last week and wanted you to answer them and give them some tips. We got a question from our viewer, Marie. She asks, how do you stop a coworker who reports private conversations between workers to the boss?
So the very first thing that I would say to Marie is this: it's very hard to stop anybody from doing anything. And so when we get into environments and we see behaviors we don't like, a lot of times people are like, well, how do I get someone to stop? That's usually not the right way to frame up the issue. If I were to talk to Marie, I would say the following. The first thing you would do is you would actually talk to that coworker. And I would say, and again, you keep the focus on the behaviors you're witnessing. So, you know, have you brought these matters to the attention of Supervisor X? Can you tell me a little bit about why you're doing that? And ask why. And it will be interesting to see what the response is. So partly that coworker could be saying, you know, I don't think I'm getting enough credit, or I don't think that I'm, you know, getting kind of my voice heard. And if you maybe try to address the underlying reason, you might be able to get her to decide to change her behavior by removing the underlying cause, rather than just trying to stop her from doing something you don't like.
Or, as we said last week, you can always control your own behavior.
Absolutely.
So if you're having private conversations that you wouldn't want your boss to hear, maybe keep them even more private.
You're
or don't
absolutely
have them in the
right.
workplace.
You're absolutely right. Because what you want to do is, instead of kind of focusing on what you're going to do to change somebody else's behavior, wow, if I really don't want my boss to hear X, Y, or Z at workplace, maybe I shouldn't be talking about it. That's a great point.
We got a second question from Jill, one of our viewers. She asks, how do you know when a coworker's bad treatment reaches the level of involving a lawyer or even the police?
Well, I think that's really hard. And one of the problems with toxic work environment is it does start to make you kind of doubt your own perception of reality. When you're in such a negative environment, you start to say, well, gosh, when do we know lines have been crossed? So here's what I would recommend to Jill. The important thing is that you document behaviors. So it's not like, wow, Rosemary was really mean to me. It's that Rosemary said X, Y, and Z. Not that you would ever do that. Rosemary said X, Y, and Z, or Rosemary did X, Y, and Z. And you start documenting those behaviors. You start documenting those words. And then I would go to an HR and I would say, this is the list of documented behaviors that I have experienced. These are the dates I have experienced them. And if you don't feel like you've gotten satisfaction from HR, then it's perfectly reasonable for you to call an attorney to talk about that. Obviously, safety is in danger at any time during your work environment or during your work day. You should absolutely call the police.
In terms of contacting a lawyer, you know, something to remind people is that making that call to an employment lawyer, you Google somebody who's in your neighborhood, in your city, that conversation is private.
Yes.
And you're not paying the person for the conversation. This is just a consultation. Is what you're describing something that could be actionable?
Yeah, that does it rise to the level of harassment, and that's why the documented list of behaviors is so important. That's what an attorney really wants to know. Not that I felt a certain way, although that's very important, but this is what happened, and these are the dates it happened.
Julie Ragatz, an assistant professor of ethics from the American College of Financial Services. Thanks so much for being with us. Thanks for answering our viewers' questions.
Oh, so happy to be with you, Rosemary. Thanks for having me.
And we'll be right back.